I don't know who I am, Nick. Like my whole life, I've been like imagining that someday I would arrive at this place where I was a grown-up adult and I would be completely different than however I was as a kid, because I imagined adults as these people who had it together. And uh, I'm learning more about myself that um, the me who I am is a generalist, and that sounds really messy and obscure and um like, what does that even mean? You're just saying nothing. And those are all these those are like critical voices that I have of myself. Um, but what I am learning is that as a generalist, what that means is I am able to understand things from a lot of different areas at some sort of depth. Um, One of the struggles with being a generalist is specificity. And I've talked to you, I've like said, hey, specifically, I'm a generalist, because that feels like a fun thing to say. And it makes me sound witty to myself until, 5 years from now, I see it pop up as a memory on Facebook and realize I wasn't funny at all. And I'm never going to repost that. That's a long lead in to one of the troubles we have with this podcast, with content that we're creating, which is a lack of specificity. Like, what does it mean that we're talking philosophy and scientists and like science and all that. So it's a struggle. It's a struggle for me as a generalist to come to this podcast and ask people, give us some of your time to listen to us. Like, well, why would they do that? Why should they? I don't know, because maybe I'm interesting, or I hope I'm interesting. But
I think you're interesting.
Well, thank you. Right? We think each other are interesting.
Yeah, I definitely think you're interesting.
That's really thoughtful. You came up with an excellent idea. So Nick, he just told me, he's like, what if we structured the podcast around quotes? Nick loves quotes. Nick,
I do.
You love quotes?
I love quotes. My arm is covered in them. I have a whole half sleeve of quotes of tattoos on my arm.
Okay, prove it. You got to prove it. Can I see?
There are so many.
There are so many. Oh my goodness.
And I have ones on this arm, and I'm just slowly turning my skin into a book.
That is amazing. For those of you who want to see it, the video of this is on YouTube. I realize it's a podcast, so it's a little odd that I'm asking him to show things, but we do have, last I checked, 3 subscribers on YouTube.
Yes.
And so those 3 subscribers, two of whom are you and me.
Yeah.
And the third one is one of my friends. So Matt.
I thought it was my mom or something.
No, it's my friend Matt. And
Hey,
he
Matt.
is going to be one of the first people to see your arm tattoos. So yeah,
You're welcome.
If you want to see it, you can go to YouTube and check it out. Nick, you suggested, what if we just do what we already like to do? What you already like to do is take a quote and dive deeper with it.
Mm-hmm.
That's brilliant. I'm excited about this. Can you tell me, do you have your ideas for the quotes that we could go with?
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with the same thing that you struggle with, which is the lack of specificity, because I too am a generalist. And to reference a Richard Feynman quote, he said, everything is interesting if you go into it deep enough. And I'm a firm believer in that. Like, I think it's really easy to look at something that, your knee-jerk reaction is like, why would someone care about that? Or that's a waste of time, or they sure have a lot of time on their hands or something, and just dismiss it. But I genuinely think everything in this universe is unreal. It is so fascinating, so interesting, no matter how mundane or boring it appears on the surface. You just got to see it with fresh eyes and dive a little bit deeper, and you will unearth so much complexity and fascination and wonder. And so that drives in me, like you, a sense of generalism. It's all interesting. Don't pin me down. I want to explore it all. So
Right.
I thought, like you said, I think framing our podcast in some way to have some sort of specificity rather than it's just two handsome, interesting dudes talking at each other the whole time. And that's our selling point. And it does a great job at attracting
one of them
our...
is like, one of them is really smart, and one of them's Dan.
And one of them is really handsome and the other one's Dan. Oh, Nick, wait. However we're framing that. But yeah, so it does a great job at attracting our friends and family. They might have some interest in listening to Nick and Dan talk, but if we want to have...
Any luck,
with any luck,
we'll get like 4 subscribers on YouTube by the end of this. So family, y'all are not doing your jobs, because I've got more family out there than we have subscribers on YouTube. Okay, please, Nick,
we have
on.
more friends and family than just Matt. So where are they at? Where are they at?
I love you, Matt. I love you, Matt. Thank you so much for subscribing.
Don't forget to click that bell, Matt.
Click.
But yeah, so some sort of specificity to offer people who may be interested in listening to this, of like, here's what we're going to do beyond just two friends chatting with each other. And the quote thing, my entire social media presence for as long as I can remember has largely revolved around me like taking all of the quotes and annotations that I've accrued over the years in my readings and everything, and I have this massive repository of interesting quotes and excerpts from the things that I'm interested in, and there's so much to do there and so much to engage in, and I thought that could be a good way of kind of framing our discussions, having a quote. And by extension, you said whoever is the author of the quote, we can treat as our guest. So in some cases, if it's a living person or someone that we know and it's a quote that we like, we could actually have them on to tell them, explore with them what the quote means to us and how it impacted us and all of that kind of thing. And even if it's somebody who we couldn't get on our podcast or they're long dead, we could still have them as like a de facto guest, as like an invisible guest with us along for the ride. And I think that is also a really interesting and novel way of thinking about our exploration of quotes.
Now, just out of curiosity, is there any chance that perhaps you may have a quote that sums that idea up from somewhere in the universe?
I'm so glad you happened to ask that question, Dan. I do, as a matter of fact, have a quote that comes to mind.
And it's beautiful.
And unsurprisingly, it's from one of my all-time favorite authors, Carl Sagan, which, for our longtime listeners, people will know that I like to say that a lot of authors and books are like my all-time favorite. But Carl Sagan...
Those of you who have been with us since episode 1... This is for... we do appreciate this, and Nick has something for us here.
I have so many favorites, but this is this is a quote from Carl Sagan. And this quote comes from his miniseries, his 1980 miniseries, Cosmos. It's from the episode, The Persistence of Memory, and he talks about books, which I love. And here's the quote. He says, "What an astonishing thing a book is. It's a flat object made from a tree with flexible parts on which are imprinted lots of funny dark squiggles. But one glance at it and you're inside the mind of another person, maybe somebody dead for thousands of years. Across the millennia, an author is speaking clearly and silently inside your head. directly to you. Writing is perhaps the greatest of human inventions, binding together people who never knew each other, citizens of distant epochs. Books break the shackles of time. A book is proof that humans are capable of working magic. And that's it.
That quote has special meaning to me, and I just feel like really, I feel really warm inside, and a little bit sad. And
Mm.
man, what a great quote! And I wasn't expecting to be emotional. I mean, let me rephrase. I'm emotional because I'm human, and so I should always expect to be emotional. I wasn't expecting to get a little teared up, and so thank you for reading that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a an tear up worthy quote. It's one of my favorites.
So what can you tell me kind of an era of when you first bumped into that quote, or like what went on for you? Why is it special to you?
I have always loved reading. As long as I could remember, like one of my favorite activities when I was a kid, I remember my dad taking me to bookstores, and still to this day, the smell of books, which, book lovers love the smell of books. There's nothing novel about that. But not only do I love the smell of books, but it transports me specifically to that time. When I was younger, those moments where my dad was taking me to the bookstore, and I would just like walk in and just be like immersed. And the library, the public library, bookstores and public libraries, and just like walking through the racks and looking at the shelves and seeing all of these pictures and authors and picking them up and having no idea who anyone was or what I was going to come across, and the wonder I felt and the excitement of just like, what is this? What is this? And like in the library and in the bookstores, I would go to like the kids section because I was a little kid. And it was just so like curated to like everything was interesting in those stacks of books. And so I fell in love with reading, and from a really young age, and books have long been just kind of like part of my personality, and that's only become more true as an adult. And now I'm an English teacher at the university, and I try to instill a love of books into my students, and a love of reading. And Carl Sagan was a science popularizer and an astronomer, and he spoke so beautifully and so eloquently about the humanities, about reading and art, and he really strived to do justice to the entanglement of art and science. And that really has always spoken to me, because as much of a passion as reading is for me, science is an equal passion for me. I love science. And I think it does such a disservice to try to conceive of them as being in conflict with one another, as if art and science detract from each other. I think they have the potential to only enrich one another. And Carl Sagan believed that and felt that and wrote so beautifully about it. And so watching Cosmos all those years ago, and I probably watched Cosmos for the first time when I was like 20, maybe in my mid-20s, somewhere in that vicinity, so over a decade ago. But when I came across Cosmos all those years ago, and I listened to Carl Sagan speak so beautifully about both science and art and reading and philosophy, it just called my name, and he is so profoundly quotable. So I came across this scientist in Sagan talking about art and the beauty of reading, at a time when I was peak interest in science. So it was just like this beautifully timed moment for me to come across him in these types of quotes and the Cosmos series. And then I proceeded to read pretty much every book that he published. And yeah, so it was, like so many things, it was well timed in my life. It was like the right time for me to come across a scientist talking so eloquently about the beauty of reading and art.
Yeah. I had a roommate in college who was the first person I ever heard mention Carl Sagan. And he mentioned it kind of like a guilty pleasure, I think was his phrasing. And Micah, I don't know if you're out there listening, but you were the person who introduced me to the name Carl Sagan. And I hadn't discovered any of his work. And then later I watched Cosmos, and like I had to put two and two together. It was like, wait a second, this is that guy that Micah was talking about. There's also the movie Contact that watched during college. And so that was my introduction, was kind of like, at first I heard the name, and then later when I watched Cosmos, the impression, just watching a scientist with such wonder talk about the universe it just had a huge impact on me as well. And so I've always appreciated the approach, like the approach that Carl Sagan had with how he communicated and how he just how he articulated his passion there. It's like Mr. Rogers meets Bill Nye, and just Bill Nye came after, so it's probably not a good comparison. That's another one of those things I probably won't post to social media out of fear of regret for the next 10 years if I get a reminder.
Yeah,
remember that time you compared Carl Sagan to Mr. Rogers and Bill Nye. Just this, but the passion for both the humanity, science, and the universe, and how he seemed to see them all come together, and how that series was shot really artistically, like being in a ship of the imagination.
Yeah.
And just brilliant. And how well he distinguished between, like, here's the things we know, but here's all of these interesting things we don't know, or like, here's the edges of our knowledge and where the wonder is. It was such a different experience watching him than what I expected when I saw an atheist. I grew up in a evangelical environment, and I was told about like scientists and atheists. They were described in such a way that it was like almost not human. Like there were these other things that existed for the sole purpose of like destroying faith, and when I actually heard someone with a completely different belief system communicating with passion, like it was really hard to square that with some of the stuff that I was taught about other people. So yeah, all of that. And then
absolutely.
Yeah,
I think that's a big part of Carl Sagan's appeal for me, is the ways in which he really does defy a lot of the stereotypes about scientists. And like so many stereotypes, those stereotypes are untrue and unjust. But there are plenty of science popularizers of today who I don't think do justice to the wonder of art and science, or art and philosophy, and the humanities generally. Some of them do. There are certain science popularizers like Hank Green and the Green brothers. I think John and Hank really are kind of like
the Green brothers.
They're so good. And I think in a lot of ways they are like the spiritual descendants of Carl Sagan's approach to popularization. Um, but, Robert Sapolsky, I think, does a really good job of doing justice to philosophy in his discussions of science. But it is true that a lot of science popularizers over the last couple decades tend to have kind of a coldness to them or an arrogance to them, where they tend to belittle people who are skeptical of science rather than kind of trying to help them understand and meet them where they're at. I mean, another Carl Sagan quote is that he says that we have to temper our criticism with kindness. And as an educator, I'm always having to remind myself of that, of like meeting students where they're at and not coming at them with like judgment, like, you don't know something that I know. What's wrong with you? But recognizing that none of us comes fully equipped, and we have to meet people where they're at. And I think Sagan just always, maybe not always, but very frequently tried to do that and did a really effective job at it. And that called my name. A compassionate science communicator who loved art and wonder and philosophy. And it's a magical combination for my sensibilities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was so interested when I found out that Neil deGrasse Tyson was just a youngster who, when he met Carl Sagan, and Carl Sagan was a huge inspiration to him. And then he ended up doing the reboot of that Cosmos series.
Yeah.
And just the way that worked, the way that it was just like, oh my gosh. Because Neil deGrasse Tyson, I've seen him engage well with people with like flat Earth ideas and all these things that just watching somebody willing to engage on that, I think what a great legacy, like of when we're able to engage with people who think completely differently. But the people who believe that the Earth is flat are not stupid.
Right.
These are smart people who, many of them are really curious and creative, and like they want to make sure they're not getting duped by like some external force. Who doesn't?
Yeah, and in that way, they are really embodying the very values that drive science and scientific inquiry. Like, they are coming at these questions with skepticism and like you said, curiosity, and the very things that we want to cultivate in a scientific mindset, and to belittle them and dismiss them as either being stupid or whatever, is really doing an injustice to the ways in which they are attempting to figure out what the world is like, which at its heart is what the scientific endeavor is all about.
Right. And then the ones who pursue that diligently and they look at the data, like, I don't know if you've seen Behind the Curve.
I have. It's a great documentary.
It's a great documentary, but the ones in that documentary that ended up really pursuing that, like coming up with creative ways to test what they're claiming, because they're like, hey, we got to make this claim, like, hey, we better show it. They ended up showing the Earth. I mean, they ended up that basically they showed the Earth was in fact not flat, and it was a globe.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. But I relate to that because what I came from in my religious background was, it was told to me like, hey, if you test these things out, or if you really pursue truth or whatever, you're going to come to our conclusions. So therefore, here's what, here's all the arguments or whatever. And you're welcome to go test these out. Like they gave me critical thinking skills that I then pursued. Now for me, ended up undoing a lot of what I was taught. It was like heavily implied that if you pursue truth, you're going to end up right back where we already have the answers. For those of us who did that, we didn't all end up exactly where I think even they expected. So I relate to how important it is to remember that we're all humans and we're like just trying to figure this thing out. And watching people engage with each other with like compassion and humanely feels so much closer to the kind of life I want to lead and person I want to be. And that it's possible to do that in a lot of different disciplines, within religion, outside of religion, within sciences, and some combination of that. Yeah. So that just, Carl Sagan, man, what a great quote.
I appreciate you. I really love the way that you said for us to like treat the author of our quote as a guest, even if they're not here. And I do think that this quote from Carl Sagan engages with that idea so beautifully, because I love to think of him as like talking to us, and us talking to him and having this, being a part of this conversation that he initiated all those decades ago. And we're talking to him long after he died. And I think that is such a beautiful sentiment to reflect on the ways in which we can stay connected with people, even those who we've lost, long afterward, through their words, through their writing, and keeping that conversation going, and us being a part of that.
Yeah. Beautiful, Nick. Beautiful. I really enjoy talking to you. Thanks for yet another great conversation, and I hope you have a good rest of your week.
It has been a pleasure, Dan.